The following is a 9-part analysis of a suicide note left by a young man in 2010. While I'm not condoning or endorsing Mitchell Heisman or his work, there are a lot of key points and aspects to this work that I think are worth looking into. As I've stated previously, any work involving nihilism or the black pill should be treated with caution. Some of the things that he says and writes in his suicide note are not for the faint-hearted. But from this, we can come to understand this man's unique outlook on life, religion, history, and politics. And finally, to reiterate, the following words are not of my own, but are the view of Mitchell Heisman in his suicide note. Part 1. Incorporation, Culture, and the Uber-Organism. Civilization originally emerged from culture and gradually transcended its normative, kin-selective roots. A culture is a native culture made possible by incorporation of the biological, social, and emergent customs into a larger, coherent social body. A person is incorporated when they exist as a cultural insider, seamlessly woven into the living values, beliefs, and ways of his or her culture. This human capacity for incorporation tends to emerge from the preconscious instincts, intuitions, and impulses steered by notions such as duty, honor, and shame, and presumably distilled out of its primal natural integration, common to those of our non-human ancestors, driven by kin-selective behaviors. In other words, culture involves organizing a social body around a system of values which arise from natural, biological subjectivities based on kinship interests. This is what explains the decisive gulf between polytheism and monotheism. The ancient Greeks and other pagans looked up to gods that were like extrapolations of progress in biological evolution. Pagan values, not unlike Nietzsche's Übermensch, worked in relative accordance with natural selection. Pagan polytheisms are, for example, conducive to caste divisions, typically drawn along ethnic racial lines, different gods of different moral standards appropriate for distinct peoples of varying status in society. Polytheism logically preceded monotheism because of this more harmonious relationship with the fact of inequality in nature. When culture reaches a level of superlative development, driven by kin selection as a basis for caste divisions and race divisions, and emerging as a corporate culture, a body of individuals whose existence as individuals is in some way subordinated to a larger whole, it becomes what Heisman terms a kin-selective uber-organism. Just as ants, bees, and Nazis form kinds of holistic uber-organisms on a social level, individual multicellular organisms such as humans are holistic uber-organisms on an individual level. The uber-organisms represents a development characteristic of strong states in the ancient world, e.g. the Egyptian uber-organism, and successful colonies in the ant world. Section 2. Symbolization, Civilization, and Mosaic Law. A person observing a culture as an outsider could learn its foreign ways, customs, and beliefs, but he does so as an outsider not integrated or incorporated into the organic life of that culture. The authors of the Bible understood Egyptian culture on a symbolic level, and by reshuffling and rearranging these symbols they recognized that something can be done that transcends the biological limits of a traditional incorporated culture. Values can be turned upside down. The lack of archaeological evidence for the Exodus is itself evidence for the thesis that the Exodus story arose a paradigmatic model for understanding the Jewish human problem in its most extreme form. As an event in mental history, rather than an event in literal history, it probably arose as a thought experiment that radicalized general historical conditions of Jews. Mosaic law was designed as a corrective for certain peculiar Jewish behavioral tendencies, which Heisman has dubbed the Jewish kinship paradox, i.e., what Jews have in common with themselves is a tendency to divide amongst themselves. The Exodus paradigm, a central component of Judaism's monotheistic revolution, represents the inversion of the pyramid as a symbol of the values of the Egyptian natural order, and its embodiment in Mosaic law enabled Jews to survive for over 2,000 years in a diasporic existence in opposition to the varying moral expectations of pagan polytheisms. The God of Jewish monotheism imposed a single, leveling standard applicable to all human beings equally, whose souls were valued as made in the image of God. These innovations, however unassuming in their early form, planted the first cultural seeds which, under the right conditions, would later sprout into modern individualism, thereby enabling the egalitarian principle. The plain fact of the matter is, nature doesn't do equality. Biological evolution proceeds not in spite of, but on account of inequalities. What this amounts to is a technological corrective, a top-down construction, a value system in opposition to highly successful and naturally evolved genetically adaptive behaviors and social structures. To grasp the significance of this religious system at its time in history, what we must recapture to mind, as George Steiner insists, as nakedly as we can, is the singularity, the brain-hammering strangeness of the monotheistic idea. See Overcoming Nietzsche in The Creation of God, page 1543. Together, these innovations represented a re-evaluation of post-biological evolution as good, and biology as, if not evil, then at the very least requiring corrective restraint. Empires had been reaping the benefits of post-biological or civilizational evolution, although they still generally held to the more ancient systems of biological values associated with culture. The Hebrew Bible itself is a foundational step from a gene-propagating strategy towards a meme-propagating strategy. Mosaic law was a value revolution which introduced the world to the idea of post-biological evolution overcoming biological evolution. When war as the typical mode of political survival continually failed, a more emphatically mimetic strategy was adopted. A good example being the development of the Mishnah in the wake of the failed Jewish revolt and the earlier destruction of the Second Temple. The Torah, with the Exodus innovation still at its center, became the portable homeland which enabled a scattered and persecuted people to survive. Jews are biological beings characterized by anti-biological values. Jewish monotheism evolved in conjunction with political failure. What distinguishes politics from economics is the formal control over biological evolution through control over who lives and who dies, who breeds and who does not breed. The historic Jewish alienation from political control helped produce, in effect, an acceptance of an inability to control extreme forms of biological political evolution. This loss of political biological control was compensated through moral control over the memes of post-biological evolution, i.e. the laws of Moses. Symbolization, or the translation of genetic interest into mimetic or non-biological interests, is a basic process of post-biological evolution. Symbolization represents a shift from culture to civilization, from genes to memes, from sociobiology to metasociobiology, from naturalistic integration to information. Instead of living values incorporated into a way of being, culture becomes analyzed and symbolized into information that can be compared or contrasted with other information. Civilization is the application of reason to life. Part 3. Christianity and Anti-Kin Selective Altruism. Jesus' teachings are interpreted on the central premise that he was the son of a rapist, not forgetting the writings of Celsus and considering the prevalence of rape during military occupations. When the evidence for the confluence of the time and place of the Roman attack in 4 BCE and Jesus' birth are put together, it appears highly probable that Mary, Jesus' Jewish mother, was raped by a Roman soldier. It is also highly probable that Jesus knew, on some level, that he was born of rape and thus born of sin. As a half-Roman, half-Jew, Jesus was a pariah of a pariah people. At the margins of both Rome and Israel, he was socially marginalized beyond both extremes. Supplemented with a modern understanding of the identity issues which children of rape often suffer from, Heisman suggests that the greater evidence for this extraordinary half-Jewish birth concerns the nature of Jesus' ethical innovations within Judaism. Jesus radicalized kin-selective altruism beyond, and ultimately in opposition to, the family. Christianity possesses an inherent mimetic genius at spreading itself across the earth because it is strategically designed to simultaneously exploit and subvert kin-selective altruism. It exploits altruism by seducing many of those with the most highly developed valuation of altruism evolved through genetic adaptation. It subverts this kin-selective altruism by uprooting its behavioral expressions against its original basis in genetic adaptation. In other words, this anti-kin selective altruism is consciously removed from its original genetically adaptive context in which the emphasis is on kinship proximity. Jesus de-emphasized Judaism's more moderate willingness to embrace ethnocentrism, e.g. prohibitions against intermarriage, the notion of being a chosen people, the striving for nationhood, etc., and formulated a universal love to encompass the stranger, the outcast, and the enemy. Jesus did praise loving your neighbor, but neighbor can be ambiguous, somewhere between family and enemy, insofar as loving your neighbor in practical terms amounts to loving your kin and your tribe, as opposed to enemies of your kin or tribe. Radicalizing the love of kin or tribe would amount to advocating radical Jewish nationalism. Jesus' reversal implied not only loving your enemies, but hating your neighbor, insofar, that is, as neighbor is connected with family in opposition to enemy. Jesus did not radicalize the corrective of the Jewish kinship paradox. Jesus radicalized the Jewish kinship paradox itself. Instead of preaching love thy neighbor as a correction of causeless hatred, Sinat Hinam, Sinat Kenam, Jesus radicalized causeless hatred itself. Causeless hatred is typically defined as a refusal to associate with a fellow Jew, and doesn't necessarily imply anger or hostility. This helps explain the sort of hate referred to in Luke 14:26, and also clarifies Jesus' behavior towards his own family. If the political can be defined with the distinction between friend and enemy, then Jesus' innovation was to define the political as enemy by loving the enemy and thus destroying the basis of the distinctly political. Whereas Jews are products of the survival success of a symbiosis of genes and memes that moderates the extremes of both by compromising both, Jesus radicalized Jewish memes at the expense of Jewish genes and thus became more Jewish than Judaism in a spiritual or theoretical sense. The end logic of this game was his carefully planned stand at Jerusalem, in which he deliberately provoked his own crucifixion. To undo the sin of rape, Jesus had to completely relinquish his biological body. Jesus' death as a gene propagator and resurrection as a meme propagator can be understood as a supernatural defiance of natural law and of natural selection. Bodily death was not the final word. Jesus rather became the word. If the battle between flesh and spirit is understood as a battle between genes and memes, sublimated into mythic terms, Jesus can be understood as taking the spirit side to its extreme. Part 4. The Norman Yoke and Liberal Democracy. Stated briefly, a long-term consequence of the Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a nepotistic class system imposed over the defeated Anglo-Saxons. Yet, as Thomas Jefferson put it, although this constitution was violated and set at naught by Norman force, yet force cannot change right. A perpetual claim was kept up by the nation for a restoration of the Saxon laws. This ongoing kinship ethnic conflict broke out most radically as the English Civil War, 1642, the American War for Independence in 1775, and the American Civil War of 1861. Liberal democracy in the English-speaking world originated in part through the evolution of this tribal struggle. Liberal democracy was founded in a revolutionary reverse discrimination against a nepotistic British political order founded in military domination. This institutionalized discrimination, a universalized Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism, is fundamentally reactionary, deriving the catalyst of its morality, its indignation, and the condition of its very cause in the success of Norman action. Consequently, it should not be surprising that the conquered harbored a prejudice against acknowledgement of the contributions that the conquerors have made to their very revolution against William the Conqueror's legacy. Some degree of intermarriage and interassimilated gradually blurred the sharp ethnic distinctions of Senlac Hill. From assimilation, intermarriage, and a new line of partly Saxon and partly non-Norman kings, a new English reality emerged. The simpler division of Norman masters and subjugated Saxons could no longer be held. But interassimilation between conquering Norman immigrants and the conquered Anglo-Saxons was both partially successful and partially unsuccessful. The distinctly ethnic divide imposed by the foreign force of Norman invaders was institutionalized and codified into a class system, which gradually transformed the ethnic conflict into a lasting cultural ordeal. Over the centuries, caste became class. The forms of political control imposed by Normans remained in place even as the ethnic boundaries became increasingly blurred. Whatever else politics may be, politics is control over evolution. Politics, the focus of decisions of war and peace, life and death, is also the focus of biological self-control, because the difference between who lives and who dies is evolution itself. The Norman destruction of the native warrior aristocracy meant that Anglo-Saxons, as an ethnicity, were reduced to a sub-political body. By destroying the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and otherwise genetically sculpting an industrious but militarily harmless slave race, the Normans sculpted not only Anglo-Saxon resentment of aristocracy, but also the nature of the Anglo-Saxons themselves. Democracy itself, the adaptation to being the sub-political body, was made possible by adaptation to the inhibition against regenerating their own native aristocracy. Modern political reductionism to equal individuals was considered superior to the more socially or collectively based regimes it replaced. See the parable of Adric and Aldred. Individualism proved to be the means of making the sub-political reduction of the Anglo-Saxon nation work for them, instead of against them. On the level of classical political patriarchy, the sub-political is female and the political is male. The democratic revolution began as a rebellion in the household of the body politic, the female body of the people against the male rulers. It aimed towards equality between the political and sub-political in an attempt to blur the distinction between the two. If an analogy can be drawn between the political-sub-political distinction and male-female gender roles, then it stands to reason that either political form in society will be more or less conducive to, or inhibitive of, the analogous behaviors expressed by individuals inhabiting that society. Consequently, all of the meanings of equality, this is one of the most fundamental. Sexual equality, the equality between the sub-political Anglo-Saxon female role and the political Norman male role. Democracy was meant to bridge the extremes of that originary caste separation. The unfolding of its logic led to individual sexual equality, the convergence of the bourgeois beta male and the masculinized female. Although progress has not increased men's ability to menstruate, it has increased men's sensitivity to the nurturing norms of compassion over the virtues of the warrior. Leftwards progress leads to progressive gender feminization. This is relevant to our larger narrative of post-biological evolution because feminism is correlated with a generally lower birth rate. The unfolding logic of individualism, especially feminism's devaluation of women's evolutionary role as childbearers, devalues kin-selective relationships in general. Native Anglo-Saxon culture never fully recovered or regenerated from the conquest and was instead replaced with the political mechanics of civilization. Yet something happened as the fundamentally feminine slave revolt principles of Anglo-Saxon civilization achieved self-realization and fulfillment. The strategies once used to weaken the patriarchal claims of Norman descendants eventually were used to weaken what remained of the Anglo-Saxon patriarchal culture. Pre-conquest England was very much a socially hierarchical culture. The conquest was a literal repression of biological factors in the sense of overcoming native values of political ethnic autonomy and self-preservation. It was not only the political destruction of a distinct Anglo-Saxon kin culture, but the destruction of the values of a living faith in that native kin culture. Christianity collapsed into capitalism, in part because Christianity attacked the patriarchal values of duty and family that override selfish individualism. Christianity helped divorce altruism from kinship, and this change, by breaking down family values, helped promote modern mass individualism. Individualism, in turn, acts as the monkey wrench in the gene machine that facilitates liberal democracy as a transitional political form between biological evolution and post-biological evolution. Christianity began a process of blunting and mollifying the deepest ethical, cultural gulfs between Jew and Gentile. The penetration of Jewish genes into the modern Gentile West is only a continuation of the anti-kin selective logic that began with Christianity. If uncompromised Christianity is judged by its effect on the political, by its effect on the ability to control biological evolution, and hence the biological future, it is ultimately a dysgenic force for a people with political control. The permanence of the Norman military occupation of England, by contrast, meant a class system evolved, like broken leg bones that were never allowed to fully heal. To walk around with the equivalent of a broken leg bone sounds helpless unless civilization technologies are invented that not only screw the separate bone parts together, but even add some dynamic bionic strengths to the legs. Like a brace or cast that guides and directs the healing of a broken bone, the Christian religion helped heal, mold, and unite early England against a breakdown into ethnic hostility. The institutions of modernity, which is to say democracy, capitalism, science, etc., are all surface-level expressions of a deeper underlying process involving the declining importance of kinship relations. These institutions could only have developed in a conducive socio-economic environment. England, after the Norman conquest, provided the first pivotal conditions. While by no means the exclusive contributor, history, as it is argued, nevertheless attests to the inordinate contributions made by post-conquest England, something which ought to be accounted for. Anglo-Saxons adapted to their subjugation under the Normans' superior kin-selective strategy by mending their ethnic wounds with Christianity and attacking kin selection itself by doing away with nepotistic values and policies such as primogeniture and entail. The cumulative result was the construction of a society of individualist spirit, greatly accelerating the emergence of the defining aspects of modernity. Part 5. Nazism and the Anglo-German Divergence. To really understand what a possible alternative to the conquest would look like, one must compare England to an ethnically similar people who never experienced that kind of or particular magnitude of perpetual foreign domination. The Norman conquest was the decisive political-cultural divergence point between converse cognates. It was through the Norman destruction of the dynamics of their aboriginal kin culture that the Anglo-Saxon became a distinctly modern people. The survival of German culture eventually gave birth to Nazism. The death of Anglo-Saxon culture gave birth to the modern individual. For Germans, there was no Norman conquest, no Magna Carta, and thus no compulsion to evolve ideas to the fundamental rule of law. This is yet another way in which German culture was never conquered by belief in the supremacy of civilization. The transition from culture to civilization in the English-speaking world began with the defeat of native Anglo-Saxon culture in 1066. Germans such as Spengler could thus see the decadence, decline, and defeat of their own culture and the prospects of Western civilization. For the Nazis, modern progress was decline or degeneration. For the modernists, Nazi progress was decline or degeneration. Nazism was a religion akin to pagan polytheism in revering values that promote progress and biological evolution. From this point of view, pagan gods can be viewed as extrapolations of progress in biological evolution, i.e., breeding a master race of Übermenschen. Nazism was a revolt of the genes, a revolt of culture against the civilizational usurpation of history. Aesthetic and philosophical movements, German Romanticism and Idealism, for example, anticipated and partly contributed to the rise of nationalist fervor in Germany. These intellectual movements were characterized by an emphasis on wholeness, unity, purity, what Heisman would say is symptomatic of a deeper mode of thought centering on the completeness of a system prioritized over the consistency of any one of its elements. Total equivalence of an organism and its direct environment is death. Bio-inconsistency is the inequality or the lack of organizational equivalence between a life form and the larger physical world. To posit bio-inconsistency is another way of positing that life is a kind of myth or falsehood that is not empirically justifiable through reference to the larger environment, precisely because its very existence is founded upon survival over and against that environment. On a human level, bio-inconsistency typically takes the form of subjectivity that is unequal to the objectively observed in the physical world. Bio-inconsistency is what defies complete reductionism, what defies an organism's complete death collapse into its contextual environment, i.e., myth, God, identity, poetry, culture, music, art, the fear of death, emotions, institutions, instincts, thymos, patriarchy, politics, and other sources of value hierarchy. One of the most comprehensive expressions of bioinconsistency may be being, and especially Heidegger's talk of gods. More commonly, bioinconsistency takes the form of the empirically unverified myth that survival is good, that willing life is somehow superior to willing death. The Nazi view exhibited superior completeness, especially in accounting for itself, and most specifically in the form of a biological self-account. The superior completeness of the Nazi view contrasts with the superior consistency of the egalitarian logic exhibited by Marxism. These two systems are logically incompatible with one another, not accidentally, but in great part because Hitler's will to a completely racial biological system of thinking evolved in a struggle against the apparent biological insanity of Marxism. In the West, egalitarian consistency takes precedence at the expense of completeness. German social uber-organismic completeness takes the precedence at the expense of egalitarian consistency. Their incompatibility is not accidental. The Anglo-Saxons evolved a strong preference for democratic or egalitarian consistency precisely because this principle could be used as an enlightened weapon to destroy the uber-organismic model that had been corrupted by the Norman conquest. The difference between the Anglo-Saxon philosophy of individualism and the German philosophy of generalism reflect a divergence of historical ethnic experience. Churchill was actually surprised that his victory against Hitler meant that he would be presiding over the unraveling of the British Empire. Although far-sighted in grasping the intentions of Hitler, Hitler was far more far-sighted than Churchill in asserting that only his movement could avert the large-scale biological decline of Western populations. In the final analysis, then, could it be said that Hitler was more far-sighted than Churchill? I do not think this is the case. It was Churchill who said, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind."